Washington Square Park is one way of looking at the African influence here in Lower Manhattan, from building streets all the way to owning land. What do you guys think would happen like in those kind of 8 decades? Because you guys just think that's like 80 years, it's like 75 years. That's like from like the Civil War to World War II. That's like World War II to 2020. That's a lot of time to build a certain culture when you're out there on your own with your own land. You got goats, you got cattle, you got a garden. I mean, we don't have records, so we have to kind of almost use our imaginations. What kind of things do you think would take place in like the land of the blacks, going from Greenwich Village, you know, sort of Christopher Street, and walk all the way to like, you know, Alphabet City? Like, what kind of things do you imagine would take place in like 8 decades of life?
Institution buildings, there's churches, schools possibly, businesses.
Probably some dancing. Probably dance. One guy named Domingo Anthony, he petitioned the Dutch West India Company for Christina to be free, and Christina was the daughter of Manuel Trumpeter, and his land was right by the Washington Monument, by Washington Square Park. He had 18 acres. He was called Captain of the Blacks because he probably was like the main guy who led the black militia to help out the Dutch. And so he still had to have somebody like petition for his daughter. This is after he died. So I'm thinking there's like almost like, you know, you're thinking about the next generation. So this guy has 18 acres of land, and then he's got his boy Domingo Anthony, who also has land close to him, who's stepping in, going to the Dutch, saying his daughter should be free as well. And so you think that's multiple generations. I'm not quite sure how different your age is from your parents, but you think from 1644 to like 1716, 1720s, that's a couple generations. And so you got like people passing land from one to the other. That's like, I got 18 acres of land, I live and I die, then Assis is there. Or I'm trying to pass it to Assis. Or Leslie got her friends and whatever. It's just all kind of ways to think about what would have took place.
So let me ask you, did they have, I mean, were they mainly like, how did they trade for goods?
Well, that's a good question. Some of the currency that was used was like cowrie shells, which is kind of interesting for me that they even use cowrie shells. They helped out doing like public works, agriculture, etc. They paid like in guilders, and so
what is that?
Guilders is like the Dutch currency, and so one of the Africans actually, like a couple, they adopted somebody, and they basically paid like 300 guilders for that person's freedom. And for somebody Dutch receiving 300 guilders from an African is like, wow, we paid allegedly 26 guilders for this whole island. Right. And here you are, generations later, giving us 300 guilders for one life. Right. This kind of shows you how much they thought about each other, how they worked together. And they also create like their own like sort of like underground railroad where they would get fined for harboring runaway Africans. Because people would kind of, you think about it, if you gotta just kind of run over Wall Street, hide out a little bit, and then get past Collect Pond, I mean, you know, you got people like Harriet Tubman going hard, getting 300 people going through states. It's a lot easier to kind of jump over Wall Street and get somewhere like the land of the blacks and hide in somebody's farm. Here's a good map. Like here's the Collect Pond right here. This right here is like the common. This is where this becomes City Hall Park, where City Hall is built. But first it was called like a common area. But where you see like the Negro Burial Ground, the reason why this is the Negro Burial Ground is because this is like the end, the extreme southern point of the land of the blacks. And so up here where you would have like the village, going toward Gramercy Park is where you basically would have like that 130 acres or 100 square acres, I mean, city blocks of like land owned by different Africans who would have their own like unique culture past Wall Street, because Wall Street basically shows you like the actual end of the colony for both the Dutch and the English. And so there's one thing I want to kind of bring in to kind of show you exactly how loose the structure was under the Dutch. Like it wasn't perfect. I don't know if it's think that everything was like sweet, like everybody black had a good life, but this is just kind of undertold. like the fact that you kind of had this a free black population. Yes, slavery began to kick in 1647 when Peter Stuyvesant came in, the guy with the peg leg, and like his hair pulled back. He had 40 slaves. He was the biggest slave owner. Whitehall, the whole street Whitehall, it's called Whitehall because he had a mansion that was so big, they called it the Whitehall Palace. And so he had like 40 slaves out in the Bowery by like 23rd Street over to like 5th Street. That started over there by like the river, East River, and came all the way over to like 5th Avenue. So dude had an insane amount of land. And he's all about the slave trade. He doesn't really care, but he still protected the fact that the Africans who had land before he got here maintained their land. I'm gonna talk to you guys a bit about something called Pinkster. Anybody ever heard of Pinkster before?
Yes.
Interesting, right? We've heard of the Pentecost, 7 days after Easter. The Dutch way of celebrating the Pentecost was called Pinkster, and they basically would have their religious practices and would tell the Africans, you can kind of like, you know, do what you want for a day, you know, day off, whatever. A lot of them would end up celebrating this Pinkster together in the common area and also in the land of the blacks. It was a several-day celebration, and the Dutch and the Africans would also celebrate together. And it's still celebrated in Holland. It's a little bit different than how it was back in the 1600s, 1700s, and it was actually, a law was passed against it in 1811 and 1813 because a lot of folks were nervous that a large gathering, public gathering of black people might lead to rebellion.
Right, like I was reading all the stupid laws for the funerals, like you can't have more than 12 people, you can't do it at night, you can't like, all to like shut all any of that down.
We're going to talk about that because 1712 was the first New York slave revolt. And we're going to talk about how after that slave revolt, you began to see more of the English saying, all right, you guys can't do this, you guys can't do that, because before that, they stepped into a system that was real loose according to how they wanted to run the colony. And so a lot of black people were kind of used to having like a lot more freedom. And then English were kind of like, how that works for us. Because in London, the black population is like 2%. But you come to New York, it's like 20%. It's like a lot of the people will come from London here like, you know, what's good with New York? And be like, okay, what's up with the bloody black people? And that was like a major thing that everybody talked about when they came here.
So let me ask you a question. Like you were saying that, you know, the land of the blacks extended as far as to Gramercy Park. What was after that? Like wilderness?
More farms. I mean, you had like certain, like, I mean, even like New Harlem was also paved by Africans. The first postal road was paved by Africans. And going up toward that direction, you would have like these boweries and these farms, and also rich families like the Cortlands, the Delanceys would have like, you know, farms out there and like estates. And so basically like New Netherland, as the Dutch called it, or New York City or like Manhattan, you know, there were like different like farms and estates in different parts outside the city limits, kind of like a suburb. So you kind of got like your city down here, or like your main colony. You get past that, and you would have these different kind of farms and areas by people who could afford blacks to kind of come and work it. So we're going to start walking a little bit further down, but as we're walking down Broad Street, something to think about is we're walking over African bodies still, because this would still be the burial ground.
Right.
And we're also walking down a street that was also paved by Africans. So it's not your everyday perspective, but you can walk down Broadway now and think about the African presence in the sense that there's African bodies under your feet next to a street that was an Indian trail, not really developed, that was eventually paved further by African labor. And so there's all kind of signs, from street names to just building at City Hall, that you might not quite think about having an African connection, but they do.